At the height of her career, with 3 Oscar nominations and a reputation as one of the most electric and authentic actresses of her generation, Debra Winger did the unthinkable. She began to walk away. There was no huge scandal, no public meltdown. That forced her out. One day she was at the very top of the Hollywood A-list, a performer whose raw, unguarded honesty burned right through the screen. And the next, she was choosing to fade out. For years, the story was whispered in Hollywood. Reduced to a simple, dismissive label, she was difficult. But that one word is a lazy and deeply unfair summary of a much more profound and heartbreaking story, the truth of why Debra Winger stepped back from the fame and fortune she'd earned is a story that begins not on a glamorous film set, but in a sterile hospital room. It's a story forged by a near-fatal accident that reshaped her entire outlook on life and filled her with a defiant spirit. It's the story of a woman who fought her way to the top only to discover that the peak was a lonely, toxic place built on compromises she just wasn't willing to make. Her struggle wasn't just with co-stars or directors, but with the Hollywood machine itself, a system she found hollow, suffocating, and deeply alienating. So, what really happened to Debra Winger? To understand why she left, you first have to understand the harrowing event that made her the fighter she became. Long before the flashbulbs of the red carpet and the hush of an Oscar nomination, Debra Winger's story began far from Hollywood glitz. Born in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, to a conservative Jewish family, her world was shaped by tradition and hard work. Her father, Robert, was a meat packer, and her mother, Ruth, was an office manager. It was a grounded Midwestern upbringing that eventually moved to California, but the values stuck. In her house, acting wasn't a serious career path. It was a fantasy, miles away from the tangible, hard-working life her family knew. This created an internal conflict for the young Winger. She had a secret, burning ambition to perform, but she kept it buried. Never one for a straight path, she sought adventure and a connection to her heritage, traveling to Israel to volunteer on a kibbutz. For a time, romanticized stories floated. Around that, she'd trained with the Israeli Defense Forces, a myth she later clarified, explaining she was simply on a youth tour. But the experience was formative, broadening her worldview and instilling in her a fierce independence that would come to define her. She was a wanderer, a seeker, already looking for a truth that lay beyond the conventional. However, her life's path was about to be violently and irrevocably altered. A single, catastrophic moment was waiting, an event so severe it would nearly end her life before her career had even begun. In 1972, at just 17 years old, Debra Winger was working at an amusement park. It was a typical teenage job, but one day a freak accident occurred with sudden, brutal force. While working, she was thrown from a truck, and the impact was catastrophic. Winger suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, a brain bleed so profound that it plunged her into a coma. When she finally regained consciousness, her world was shattered. She was left temporarily blind and with paralysis on the entire right side of her body. Doctors delivered a devastating prognosis, suggesting she might never see again and could spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. The dream of becoming an actress, once a secret flicker of hope, now seemed like a cruel joke. The future they painted wasn't one of stardom, but of survival. For months, this was her world: darkness, silence, paralysis, and the crushing weight of what she'd lost. It was in this abyss, stripped of everything, that a new resolve began to form, a promise she would make to herself in the dark. Those months of recovery were a crucible for Debra Winger. It was a time of immense physical struggle, but also profound introspection. With nothing but her own thoughts, she contemplated her life, her secret dreams, and the fears that had held her back. It was during this grueling period that she made a solemn vow: if, by some miracle, she recovered, if her sight returned and she could walk again, she would no longer be afraid. She would move to California and chase her dream of becoming an actress with every ounce of her being, without compromise or apology. And then a miracle happened. Slowly, painstakingly, her vision started to return. The fog of blindness lifted. The paralysis receded, and she began the arduous process of learning to walk again. Each step was a victory. The young woman who emerged from that hospital wasn't the same one who had entered. The accident had forged her. It had burned away trivial fears and societal pressures, leaving a core of unshakable determination. This experience became the bedrock of her personality and career. Her future reputation for being difficult wasn't born from ego, but from the searing knowledge of how fragile life is, and from a promise to never waste a moment of her second chance on anything less than what she believed to be true. She didn't just survive. She was reborn with a purpose. Armed with this hard-won conviction, Debra Winger stormed Hollywood. She wasn't some naive hopeful, she was a survivor with nothing to lose. Her early years were a grind. She landed a part as Drusilla, Wonder Woman's younger sister, in the hit TV series Wonder Woman, a role that gave her exposure but was a far cry from the complex work she craved. Her true breakthrough came in 1980 with Urban Cowboy, the role of Sissy, a fiery woman who could hold her own with John Travolta's character, was highly sought after. Winger beat out more established actresses, showcasing a raw, unvarnished quality that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just playing a character. She seemed to be living it on screen. The famous mechanical bull scenes were a perfect metaphor for her approach. She threw herself into the role with fearless physicality and an emotional honesty that felt dangerous and real. The film was a massive hit, and overnight, Winger was a star. Hollywood had found its next great talent, but the industry would soon find that the very qualities that made her brilliant, her intensity, her honesty, her refusal to fake it, would make her a radical and challenging presence behind the scenes. In Hollywood, there's a script for everything: how to behave in interviews, how to talk to studio heads, and how to play the fame game. Debra Winger read that script and threw it in the trash. Her defining characteristic was a radical, unfiltered honesty. In a town built on carefully constructed images, Winger was a truth-teller. She said what she thought, fought for what she believed in, and refused to fake enthusiasm for a scene or a film she felt was false. This uncompromising stance immediately earned her a label that would follow her for her entire career: difficult. When a man was outspoken, he was a passionate artist. When Winger did it, she was branded as unmanageable and combative. The legendary Bette Davis, known for her own strong will, once said, "I see a great deal of myself in Debra Winger, who has already acquired a reputation for being difficult because she cares about the project." Winger's difficulty was almost always in service of the work. She once famously stated, "Bad acting is the ultimate inconsideration." She believed the audience deserved the truth and was willing to fight for it, even if it meant alienating the most powerful people in the room. This commitment came at a steep price. One tallied on the sets of her most acclaimed films. In 1982, Winger starred in An Officer and a Gentleman, a role that earned her her first Academy Award nomination and solidified her A-list status. The film was a massive success, but behind the scenes, the atmosphere was anything but romantic. The set was a battleground. Her relationship with co-star Richard Gere was notoriously frosty. While their on-screen chemistry was electric, off-screen, there was nothing. Winger later famously described acting opposite him as working with a brick wall. Their co-star, Louis Gossett Jr., confirmed in his memoir that the two had no personal interaction once the cameras stopped rolling. Gere himself admitted there was tension, while Winger was more candid. Later acknowledging her own insecurities at the time made her lash out, but her struggles weren't just with her co-star. She clashed intensely with director Taylor Hackford and producer Doane Simpson. The production environment was rife with casual sexism. At one point, there were demands for her to take diuretics on days the filmmakers decided her face looked puffy, treating her body like a prop to be manipulated. Winger pushed back. She refused to do publicity for the film, a clear sign of her disdain for the experience. She fought against script changes she felt betrayed her character, at one point halting production over a scene that felt psychologically false. Hackford was furious, but after reviewing her arguments, he eventually conceded she was right. She won the creative battle, but the war for her reputation was being lost. If the tensions on An Officer and a Gentleman were a quiet war, the set of 1983's Terms of Endearment was a public spectacle. The film would become a classic, earning 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, and landing Winger her second Oscar nomination. The dynamic between her character, Emma, and Shirley MacLaine's formidable aura was the heart of the film. Art, in this case, imitated life because, off-screen, the two actresses were locked in a legendary feud. From their first meeting, the friction was evident. MacLaine, a Hollywood veteran, was taken aback by Winger, the brash, combat boot-wearing rebel. Their working relationship was a constant sparring match, with the press full of rumors of their animosity. The most infamous story was recounted by MacLaine in her 1995 memoir, where she claimed that during a tense moment, Winger passed gas in her direction. Winger has never explicitly denied the Wilder stories, acknowledging their combative relationship. The rivalry peaked at the Academy Awards, where both were nominated for Best Actress. When MacLaine's name was called, she strode to the stage and triumphantly declared, "I deserve this," a line many saw as a final jab at her co-star. Years later, the narrative has softened, but at the time, the feud helped cement Winger's public image as a provocateur who just couldn't get along. The high-profile feuds were symptoms of a much larger conflict. Debra Winger was fundamentally at odds with the Hollywood system. Her clashes weren't just personal spats. They were ideological battles. Against an industry she found increasingly superficial, she battled with acclaimed filmmakers like James L. Brooks on Terms of Endearment and Bernardo Bertolucci on The Sheltering Sky. Her approach was always about the work's integrity. "I do admit to being challenging," she once said, "but it's always for the work." She grew to despise the machinery of promotion, the endless press junkets and vapid interviews. She turned down major roles, including the lead in A League of Their Own, reportedly because she refused to work with Madonna, whom she didn't consider a serious actress. She was also forced to drop out of Peggy Sue Got Married after a serious offset back injury. With each passing year, her frustration grew. She saw the roles being offered to women becoming less complex. "The parts that were coming I wasn't interested in," she explained. "I'd already done that, or I'd already felt that I needed to be challenged. My life challenged me more than the parts." The Hollywood game, with its emphasis on fame over art, felt hollow. She felt like a sponge when it saturated, unable to absorb any more of the industry's artifice. A breaking point was coming. In 1995, Debra Winger was just 40 years old, fresh off her 3rd Academy Award nomination for Shadowlands. By any measure, she was still at the top of her game. And it's at this moment she made a choice that sent shockwaves through the industry. She decided to take a break. It wasn't a sudden disappearance, but a conscious, deliberate retreat. She stopped reading scripts. She stopped taking calls. She simply stepped away from the career she had fought so hard to build. Hollywood was stunned. Why would anyone voluntarily walk away from that level of success? For Winger, the reason was simple. The work was no longer fulfilling. "I wanted out." For years, she admitted in 2002, "I got sick of hearing myself say I wanted to quit." Her departure wasn't an act of failure. It was an act of self-preservation. She was choosing a life over a lifestyle. She wanted to focus on her marriage to actor-director Arliss Howard, whom she married in 1996, and on being a mother to her sons, Noah, from her marriage to Timothy Hutton, and Gideon, who was born in 1997. As she explained it, it wasn't about running away from Hollywood, but running towards a personal life she felt she'd been missing. The tragedy wasn't that she left. It was that the industry had become a place she could no longer stand. Debra Winger's vanishing act wasn't a retreat into obscurity, it was a deep dive into authenticity. She and her husband, Arliss Howard, settled into a life far from the Hollywood hustle, moving to New York and living on a farm. She traded red carpets for gardening and film sets for raising her children. In 2002, her self-imposed exile became the subject of Rosanna Arquette's documentary, Searching for Debra Winger. In it, Winger explained her decision with striking Clarity, it was about embracing a life she could fully inhabit. During her time away, she also accepted a fellowship at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. This period was a reclamation. She was no longer Debra Winger, the movie star, a persona she'd always felt disconnected from. She was a wife, mother, and activist, rediscovering herself outside the narrow confines of her public image. She had pushed the pause button not because her career had stalled, but because her life demanded to be lived more fully. After a 6-year absence, Debra Winger slowly began acting again, but on her own terms. It wasn't a desperate grab for the spotlight. It was a series of careful, deliberate choices. She returned to the screen in 2001 in Big Bad Love, a film written and directed by her husband, Arliss Howard. Her subsequent roles were sporadic but powerful. In 2008, she appeared in Jonathan Demme's Rachel Getting Married, delivering a critically acclaimed performance. She earned an Emmy nomination in 2005 for the TV film Dawn Anna and later joined the HBO series In Treatment. From 2016 to 2020, she had a significant role in the Netflix series The Ranch and gave a memorable performance in the 2020 indie film Kajillionaire. Each of these roles reflects her new ethos: complex, deeply human characters in smaller, story-driven projects. She was no longer playing the Hollywood game. She had successfully rebuilt a career that suited her life, not the other way around. The fire hadn't been extinguished. It was just being tended more carefully. So, what is the ultimate tragedy of Debra Winger? For years, the narrative was that a brilliant but difficult actress sabotaged her own career. But to see it that way is to miss the point. The real tragedy wasn't her departure, but the toxic, sexist, and creatively stifling environment that made leaving a necessary act of self-preservation. Was Debra Winger difficult? Or was she simply a woman who demanded the same respect and creative agency freely given to her male counterparts? A generation of actresses who followed her, speaking out in the #MeToo era, have validated her struggle. Winger was fighting battles against industry sexism decades before it was a mainstream conversation. Her bad behavior was often just a refusal to be belittled or to deliver a performance she didn't believe in. She once said, "If a man did what I did, they'd call him a genius, but me? I was trouble." Viewed through a modern lens, her story isn't one of failure, but of quiet personal victory. She didn't burn out or fade away. She looked at the pinnacle of fame and decided it wasn't worth the cost to her soul. She chose herself. She chose her family. She chose authenticity over artifice. Her legacy, therefore, is twofold. It lives in the indelible performances she gave in films like Urban Cowboy, An Officer and a Gentleman, and Terms of Endearment. But it also lives in the powerful choice she made to walk away. Debra Winger didn't vanish. She liberated herself. And in doing so, she left a story not of tragedy, but of rare and courageous integrity. What do you think? Was Debra Winger's departure from Hollywood a tragedy or a triumph? Was she a difficult actress or a pioneering woman who refused to compromise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's most fascinating stories. In the end, the story of Debra Winger is a powerful lesson about the nature of success. Hollywood defines it with box office numbers and golden statues. Winger chose to define it on her own terms, with truth, with family, and with the freedom to be herself. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the most radical act isn't to win the game, but to refuse to play. She didn't just have a career. She built a life, and that may be the most inspiring performance of all.